I want to welcome you to tonight's event, Hannah Arendt's Disruptive Truth-Telling, a discussion occasioned by the 50th anniversary of one of the most provocative and influential works of journalism and of political science and of philosophy in the last century, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. We'll talk about that book and about Hannah Arendt and many other issues, but as we do so, I want you to imagine that you're sitting not here in the beautiful World Room, but in a cafe in 1963, maybe here on the Upper West Side, maybe in West Berlin, maybe in Jerusalem. Cafe populated by Hannah and other German refugee intellectuals. Cigarettes are being smoked by everyone constantly, all the time. The drinks and the coffee are flowing, and the arguments and debates are flowing even faster. That, I hope, will be the spirit of conversation tonight. Over the last few months, all of us in this room have witnessed, struggled with, I think, probably anyone in this room, a series of events which to any sentient conscience pose questions that defy easy answers. To pick just a few, a murderous regime in Syria versus the catastrophic experience of U.S. intervention in the Mideast, national security, individual conscience, privacy, secrecy, all weighed against one another in the WikiLeaks and Snowden cases. A government at this very moment shut down, in part because of the power of a faction driven in no small part by the political power of armaments manufacture. This is all of them issues that in some way involve confronting violence and its place in politics, its place in civic affairs, and the push and pull between accountability and power, individual and society. Those of you here who are journalists, how many working or student journalists in the room? Just most of us. We have a particular burden when covering these stories because we need to be narrating these events even as the backstory and where they lead is not clear to us. And we don't have the answers, either as journalists or as citizens. But we do have an example. We have many examples, but one of the most potent we have is this little book. It's not a huge book. Published first in 1961 as a series of articles in the New Yorker magazine. In 1963 as a book by an émigré philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who went to Jerusalem to cover the trial, the war crimes trial of Adolf Eichmann. At that time, she refused easy answers. She refused easy excuses for anyone, and instead she examined the accused's biography. She examined his words, his self-justifications, his witting and unwilling collaborators, his bureaucratic role, asked very hard questions, came up with a still controversial and potent thesis about the banality of evil, but also about collaboration and complicity and how it is that large-scale evil happens. At that time, and in our time, it's still a fiercely debated book. But for some of us who encountered this book, as I did in my late teens, and probably many of you you're here because you've had encounters with Hannah Arendt and Eichmann in Jerusalem. It was also a model for inquiry, a model for refusing to settle for settled answers, and driving home through the text of public events to drive at a new sense of what this all means. This is all on our minds again and is being debated again, in part because of the 50th anniversary, in part because of the remarkable biopic, simply called Hannah Arendt, directed by Margareta von Trotta, released earlier this year. We'll show a quick clip from that in a minute. Today we're going to have a conversation, and Hannah Arendt was both a journalist, not only for The New Yorker, but for German language newspapers and in other ways. And she was also, of course, primarily a philosopher. So I thought, what better way to think about violence in our lives, violence in the Nazi era, violence and journalism, than a conversation between a journalist and a philosopher. So we got two people here today. We have Tina Rosenberg, who is a columnist for the New York Times, former editorial writer, MacArthur winner, and the author of 3 books, all of them for sale and back. I'm not going to do the whole biography, but you should go buy her books, Haunted Land, Children of Cain, and last title, because Susan Bogarted my copy.
Join the club.
Yeah, join the club.
You gave it to me.
Joining the club, yes, it's true. And one of the great human rights journalists of our era who followed in many ways in the footsteps of Hannah Arendt by examining complicity and responsibility in Latin America and in Europe, and now looking in her new book at positive ways that social peer pressure can work. And Susan Neiman directs the Einstein Forum in Berlin, is the author of Evil, one of her great books, Study and Moral Clarity, a guide for grown-up idealists. Oh, also in the back, Dart Center stress balls. Take them, don't bobble them, they're for you. And also has sort of followed the opposite path from Hannah Arendt. She, as a young Jewish American scholar, moved to Germany and has built a life there, and so in very much the same way straddles both continents, looking at European affairs from the standpoint of an American and American affairs as a resident of Europe, and has been studying and looking at Hannah Arendt's work and deeply influenced by her whole life. We're going to have a conversation with them, but before we do, I think it would be fun to take a quick look at a short clip from the film Hannah Arendt, which captures a moment during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, when Arendt has been witnessing the trial and is sitting in a cafe in Jerusalem with some of her expatriate refugee friends, talking about what she is seeing and what she is thinking. Hit it.
Eichmann kein Antisemit? Was ist denn das für ein Humbug?
Du hast ihn doch selber gehört, er hat nur dem Gesetz gehorcht. Er hätte jedem Gesetz gehorcht.
Aber ich bitte Sie, jeder, der in die Partei eingetreten ist, dazu als SS, war ein überzeugter und bösartiger Antisemit.
Er schwört, er habe nie einen Juden persönlich verletzt.
Das kann er lange behaupten.
Aber ist es ja nicht interessant, dass ein Mann, der alles getan hat, was ein mörderisches System von ihm verlangt hat, der sogar eifrig genaueste Details über seine feine Arbeit ausbreitet, darauf besteht, dass er persönlich nichts gegen Juden hat. Falsch, er lügt nicht.
Hannah, du gehst ihm auf den Leim.
Er behauptet, er hätte nicht gewusst, wo die Züge fuhren. Glauben Sie das etwa auch?
Für ihn war es unwichtig, das zu wissen oder nicht. Er beförderte Menschen in den Tod, aber er fühlte sich nicht verantwortlich dafür. Denn einmal die Züge in Bewegung gesetzt, war seine Arbeit getan.
Ach, und er meint, deswegen habe er keinerlei Schuld an dem, was danach mit den Menschen geschah, die von ihm betaubert wurden.
Ja, genau so sieht er es. Er ist Bürokrat.
Deine Suche nach Wahrheit ehrt dich, aber diesmal gehst du in die Irre.
Aber Kurt, du kannst doch nicht leugnen, dass ein riesiger Unterschied besteht zwischen dem unvorstellbaren Grauen seiner Taten und der Mittelmäßigkeit des Mannes.
Keine Sorge, Rachel. Hannah und ich haben uns schon immer so gestritten.
Ich habe nur Angst, dass sie noch viele Menschen verärgern wird.
Das ist nun mal ihre Natur. Sie kann nicht anders.
We'll just sort of take it from here. I know that, to me, my own encounter as a late teenager with this book very much shaped my sense of the possibilities of journalism. And as I think about the history of our craft, I think it also has a lot to do with the kind of human rights journalism that followed in the 70s and 80s, folks looking at Latin America, at Russia, at South Africa and elsewhere, and the US. But I wonder maybe if each of you, starting with Tina, could talk about your own encounter with Eichmann in Jerusalem and Hannah Arendt. You've talked about it as the most important, most influential book in your life.
It's true. And actually, I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but after talking to you when we first talked about doing this panel, I went back and thought about how much it's affected all of my books. I mean, everything I've written. And it's just been hugely influential. I mean, for me, I don't remember exactly when I read it, probably well after college, because I didn't read anything of consequence in college. And it might have been when I was living in Nicaragua, which I'd gone to Nicaragua in 1985 just because I wanted to do something different. I wasn't even certain I was going to be a journalist at that point and didn't speak Spanish. It was just, I wanted to visit the moon, basically, and that was it. But reading that book it gave me many things. It gave me what would become sort of my lifelong focus on the mind of the perpetrator. My first book, Children of Cain, was about 6 different perpetrators in 6 Latin American countries and why they did what they did. My theme of looking at conscience and morality and why people do violence. But beyond that, also the method of writing about that she perfected, I think, writing about the ideas that she wrote about using the focus of a person, which I think when you're writing for an American audience, as she was, is the only way to do it, and by far the best way to do it. And also her tone. I love the idea that she could, that she didn't have to accept what anybody was saying. She could decide for herself what she thought. And that, in some ways, was very new to me in the world of journalism.
Yeah, that tone is a big part of it, isn't it? It's not quite Olympian, certainly independent, deeply ironic. But also deeply fact-based and document-based. It's interesting. What about you, Susan? What was your
Well, I do want to
encounter?
pick up the remark about tone, because I very much agree with both of you. Her tone has been criticized, and I think that's a huge mistake, despite the fact that English was her 5th language. Her English is gorgeous, and she's somebody who talks about how influenced she was by poetry, for example. So the claim that she maybe was making mistakes in tone can't be right. I'm not sure it's Olympian, but I think she's very clear about where she's ironic and where she's sublime. And in other things outside the book that she either said or that one can read, she said very clearly she wanted to use an ironic tone in regard to Eichmann. She talks about Brecht, thinking the best weapon against evil isn't sort of thundering, it's irony, it's comedy. And the one point where she gets quite passionate and even sublime is in the moment she talks about Anton Schmidt, who was an Austrian soldier who actually was shot for helping the resistance. And it's a passage that even if you've read it about 12 times, which I think I have, can still bring tears to your eyes. So I think the tone is really important, and we ought to defend it.
I've taught in a journalism class the opening sentence of the book, which sets so beautifully the scene of the trial, and in a few sentences positions. All right, we'll just do it.
Bet HaMishpat.
Yeah, Bet HaMishpat, the House of Justice. These words, shouted by the court usher at the top of his voice, make us jump to our feet as they announce the arrival of the 3 judges who, bareheaded in black robes, walk into the courtroom from a side entrance to take their seats on the highest tier of the raised platform. It's actually got everything in it. It's got the what, it's got the who, it's got the place, all that stuff that we teach in a very abstract way, packed into one narrative sentence. It's vivid, exciting writing. But talk more about your
Well, I guess
collision with this
I
woman.
wish philosophy had been as influenced by Hannah Arendt as journalism has. I actually know exactly when and where I read Eichmann in Jerusalem for the first time. It was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was 25 years old. I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I had a terrible flu, and which is sort of important because I was at the time either so driven or nerdy, take your pick, that if I had been well, I would have confined myself to reading Kant or something, something suitably, work-oriented. And this was what I allowed myself to do for kind of flu recreation. People get older and wiser, fortunately. And it was not, as she herself says in this very famous, in the Gauss interview, she was not considered to be a philosopher at all. It was considered, either journalism or maybe political theory. I believe, although I'm not in as much touch with various American philosophy departments these days as I used to be. Certainly up to the 90s, nobody taught Hannah Arendt in this country in a philosophy department. In the 90s, there began to be a fascination with her, but I believe it's still the case that it's mostly in political science departments or political theory departments that she gets read. For me, it represented, I suppose, two things. In different orders, well, maybe it's the same thing. It was somebody doing philosophy in a way that I had thought philosophy ought to be done when I first got into the business, reading Sartre and de Beauvoir. But I think in many ways in a much more conceptually rigorous and interesting way but we want to stay on Arendt, than the existentialists. And it was someone talking about the most important moral and political issues of the 20th century, which, alas, often get extremely short shrift in philosophy departments. So it stayed with me, and then when I moved to Berlin a few years later, of course, where she was taken seriously, it blossomed, both as a question of style. I mean, that one actually, you might not get rewarded for it among many people, members of the profession, but it was a way to do philosophy. And then my own work on the problem of evil, which I won't say it was started by Eichmann in Jerusalem. There were other pieces of it that had to do with my interest in the Enlightenment and realizing actually that the Enlightenment was not this sort of sunny, optimistic era that people take it to be, but actually they thought more seriously and interestingly about the nature of evil than probably most anybody since. And you're actually right. It's been a little eerie to me that my life in certain ways has followed an oddly, I won't say parallel path, but there are these deep points of contact. Yeah.
At the heart of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the sort of central thesis of it is announced in the title, but not actually articulated in the book itself until the very end, this idea of the banality of evil, which we just saw the character in the film sort of working out, but the idea of perpetrators of mass violence as, if not faceless and anonymous, at least weak-willed followers, bureaucrats, unremarkable individuals who are capable of great evil. I think you even went so far as to talk in one of your books about the little war criminal inside all of us, and questions of people who obey, don't obey. How do you think that thesis holds up now? How do you think about it now? Why don't you start on that, Tina?
Depends on what you mean by now. I mean, certainly, it is, I think, an ineffable part of the human condition. And my first book was about Latin America, and one of the chapters was in Chile. And the perpetrator I chose to write about in Chile was an ordinary man. This was sort of my. He wasn't even complicit in any way in the crimes of Pinochet. He had been a socialist. He had been an Allende supporter who went underground after Pinochet's coup, and then surfaced and had sort of an ordinary life, and opened a series of secondhand clothing stores that did very well in a sort of marginal series of neighborhoods in Santiago, and got himself a color TV on credit and a car, and decided that actually this was not a bad government. And, you know, people talked to him about human rights abuses, and he didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. And, I mean, and this is someone who would have been on the other side before. And he was very typical of Chileans. And in 1983, when the whole thing crashed, then he believed it, because the economy went to hell, and because all of a sudden his ability to buy, you know, the bills he was paying for the things he had bought on credit were he couldn't pay them anymore. That's what woke Chileans up back then to the human rights abuses. And also, the Chilean rights response to Pinochet, even, you know, 30 years later, they defended him up till the end, until the corruption allegations. And that's when people on the right wing of Chile started to recognize there were problems here.
So you found support for this notion, the sort of Eichmann notion of the banality of evil, in your work in Latin America?
Absolutely. I think you'd find it anywhere. Yeah.
What about you, Susan? How are you thinking about that thesis now?
Before I answer that question, I want to make a remark to your quote of Tina's, the little dictator, the little war criminal in all of us. That's a thesis that actually Arendt vehemently opposed. She said she was not arguing for an Eichmann in all of us, and it depends, and this is where I think a little philosophy, maybe not too much, but a little philosophy does help understand some of the theses of the book, because she very much wants to deny that there's no difference between being a potential criminal and an actual criminal. She thinks that it's the actuality that makes a difference, and not one's subjective state. So she really thinks that that's the important moral difference, and I guess I agree with her on that. Whatever experiments, whether it's the Milgram experiments or the Zimbardo experiments or whatever you want to look at, show, I think, plus any kind of historical researches that one wants to do, show that the potential for at least going along with mass murder is enormous in all of us, and that actually it's more dangerous. I mean, that sort of ordinary ways of the kind of example that you're describing, of going along with murderous regimes because our lives are comfortable that way, accounts for a great deal more evil than sort of masterminds, ideological masterminds. I think that's true. I had to tell Bruce, who is a good organizer, tried to prepare this a couple of months in advance and called me up in Berlin and said, so tell me, what kinds of things do you think you're going to be saying? And I said, look, I've been thinking about this book for 20 years, and I have a view, and here's what it is. I still partly have that view, but I finished reading about 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago, I'm not sure anymore, a monumental study that was published in German about 2 years ago and that will come out in English in the coming year. I recommend it to all of you. Since this book was published 50 years ago, it has engendered, for reasons that I'm not entirely sure of. Countless attempts at refutations and takedowns, and, she was a closet anti-Semite, or she was sleeping with the enemy, or,
A lot of it was about what she said about Jewish complicity.
Yeah, I mean, I even think that wasn't properly understood. We can perhaps
And we should talk about
that
I think that's a
later.
really important piece.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that was deeply misunderstood. So anyway, there were perhaps decent reasons for attacking her. There were a lot of indecent reasons for attacking her. But I had never read anything that actually struck at the heart of her thesis about Eichmann until about 2 weeks ago. There is new research, 700 pages of it. But extremely well written, and by someone who doesn't see herself as attacking Arendt. On the contrary, sees herself as in dialogue with Arendt, and even says she thinks Arendt would have had a researcher's delight had she been able to see this new material, which no one at the time knew, and which was kept sealed by a combination of the West German intelligence agencies, the Vatican, and the CIA. It is now, without a doubt, and we should sort of try and analyze this little clipping about what actually was wrong in this clipping. By the way, just to, Fontrata is publishing a book, or it's just come out in German with the film, and she asked this researcher to write a piece for it. So it's anyway. So what this shows, without a doubt, based on 200 hours of tapes which were transcribed and then signed and annotated by Eichmann, that Eichmann remained an absolutely convinced and passionate Nazi before the war, during the war, and for 15 years after the war. And the thesis, which, I mean, I assume most people in the room are here because they read the book and they know something about the thesis of the thoughtless mass murderer can't be upheld anymore. There are passages which he wrote himself where he actually talks about philosophy. It's not good philosophy, but he actually sits and thinks about, well, what about morality? Well, which morality shall we take? Somebody is nodding. I assume she's read she's read this book. We cannot any longer defend the banality of Adolf Eichmann.
That's
okay.
a pretty important part.
It's really important research. It's the first time that I've ever had to completely revise something that I had, thought about and worked on for 20 years.
I will say that Susan came into my office an hour ago and said, I just need to tell you I've had a conversion experience.
And the question remains, what exactly are the consequences of this new research for this book, which I still think is one of, if not the greatest work of moral philosophy of the 20th century? I think the thesis of the banality of evil holds for the vast majority of people who, even many people join the Nazi Party, okay? Not to mention all the people who aided and abetted the war and the Holocaust. There's no question about it, okay? And post-Holocaust, for all the other forms of systemic evil that we have to face and think about and do something about. It's clearly not true of the man Adolf Eichmann. And I think that raises important questions that need to be thought through, and I'm far from done thinking them through myself, about the role of ideology in committing mass crimes. So maybe I'll stop there and let
Yeah, and you spent a lot of time thinking about Stanley Milgram's famous experiments about obedience and all that. How does all of this filter through to you?
Actually, the phrase "the little war criminal that lives inside all of us" I used in association with the Milgram experiments, and
Which maybe since there are many younger folks here who wouldn't know that, summarize.
Don't they
Okay.
have to read the Milgram experiments in school? I don't
experiments
College, I
that
mean.
were carried out just after the trial, where Milgram asked people who did not know that the person in the other room was a Confederate to administer electric shocks. You've all heard of them. You've all heard how almost everybody went up to the maximum because they were told to do so, even though the Confederate in the other room was screaming in pain. The reason I wrote about it was, this was in my most recent book, Join the Club, the subtitle of which is How Peer Pressure Can Transform the World. Milgram did not only his basic experiments, but he did 19 different variations, looking at things, for example, does it make a difference if a woman is present, if the administrator is dressed differently, if the authority figure seems to have more authority or less. And the greatest variation he found was in number 17. This was the experiment where the people refused to administer shocks, and the reason they did so was that they had peers who also refused to administer the shocks, and the peers were Confederates of Milgram. But the peers said, no, I'm not going to do that, and when the peers said no, then the subjects of the experiment said no, and it was the variation in which the subjects were the most defiant to following this illegal order. And I used that as part of this book that talks about peer pressure, which is generally assumed to be a purely negative effect. Of course, it's a neutral effect. It can also be a force for good, and the book explores how it has accomplished social change in a way that other things have not accomplished.
One of the, what were you were about to leap?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. How are you thinking, how do you feel about what Susan is suggesting and the sort of the difference between Eichmann and
It's amazing.
others?
I mean, all I can say is the banality of evil is still held in Chile, as far as I can tell.
Oh, it's still held in Germany, and it still, I believe, holds in this country.
And when you say that, and it still holds in this country, what do you have in mind? Pick your evil. I mean, there's a big array out there, but I'm curious, actually.
Let me count the ways. Where do I start? Look. I find the way in which we have, just to pick one, that strikes me as one of the more major systemic evils that we've had to see in the past few years. I think the way that we have managed to accept Citizens United and not get up in the streets and say, wait a sec, what did you just do to my democracy? Is an example of, look, I've said things. Just like everyone else, I have a family, I have a private life, I have a work to do. We get caught in not doing enough. But if you had to ask me what I think the biggest, apparently banal systemic evil with the most consequences, both for this country and, I live in Europe, I follow U.S. news extremely closely. So do many other people. It's extraordinarily how well informed other people are about things like Citizens United, because it affects the entire world. It doesn't simply affect the United States. So if I had to pick one, that would be it.
If you had to pick one, what would it be?
I mean, I agree that is a major and far-reaching evil. I'm not sure that people's failure to protest it is an example of the banality of evil or of citizen complicity. Now, I'm sure there'll be an argument from that, but.
What, do you have one that you would pick out of a hat?
Um,
Or not? I mean,
I have to think about it.
let me throw one out and just see
Let
if
me
either of you-
just on the Citizens United question, I think perhaps one of the things that happens, my son, let's see, how old is he now? So Citizens United was 2010, he was like 25, and he came over one night for dinner. He was quite savvy, interested, literate young artist. And he said something like, how are you? I said, well, privately I'm fine, but I'm really depressed about the world. And he said, why? And he hadn't read the newspaper. He thought I might be referring to something else. He hadn't read the papers in a couple of days. And I explained the decision to him, and he looked at me and said, Ma, they're already running everything. What does it matter? And I don't know how broad that is across that generation, but it's very scary, it seems to me.
Let me throw one out there and just see what either of you think. How would Hannah think about drones? Pick something that's been in the news a lot lately that I think seems to bother a lot of people in the U.S. and around the world.
Well, I think she'd fix on the idea that the drone is a way to kill bureaucratically, without physical violence that you do. You can remove yourself from it. I think she would find some interesting things to say about that. How it makes it much easier.
I completely agree, and that reminds me of her first husband, Gunther Anders, claimed about the relative evil of Hiroshima and Auschwitz. I mean, I don't think drones count as Hiroshima, but he made a very interesting distinction in which he said, you probably have to have a worse soul to be able to, lead somebody into a gas chamber than you do to drop a bomb on them. But in the long run, the more devastating and consequential form of evil might just be the atomic bomb. And again, drones aren't atomic weapons, but something exactly about the ability to distance oneself from what one is doing it's clearly, it's both an Arendtian and even a bit of an Andersian claim.
Let me ask one other sort of unavoidable historical question, and then we can move on to some other stuff. The second thesis of Eichmann in Jerusalem, which was so controversial in 1963 and remains controversial today, is about the role of Jewish leadership in Europe in colluding with Nazis in speeding along what became the Holocaust. Both of you have looked so carefully and thoroughly and deeply at European history and at the atrocities of the Second World War and the Nazi era and history since and all of these things. How do either one of you think about that piece of the book, about the controversy that still surrounds it, which is still being articulated today, whatever? Was she right? Was she wrong?
I don't know what I think about that. So you go ahead, Susan.
I do know what I think about it.
Why am I not surprised?
No, I don't know what I think about everything. I try to say so when it's true. But you see, I think to understand what the Jewish councils are doing in that book, and one also has to look at the fact that right in the same passage, she talks about the so-called inner immigrants, that is, people who said, they were opposed to the Nazis, but they stayed. I mean, there were some genuine cases, but I've got to tell a great joke that some of you might have heard. This is a genuine emigre comes back to the Frankfurt airport, and this is, of course, a pre-9/11 joke, and walks up to the first person he meets and says, "Were you a Nazi?" And no, heavens no. I was always innerly opposed to them. And he asks the second person, and the second person says, "No, of course not. I was an inner immigrant." And the third person says, "Yeah, I was a Nazi." And the man says, "Thank God, an honest man. Will you watch my bags for 5 minutes while I go to the toilet?" So, I mean, it's complicated. there were some people who stayed and, not only acted in, devious, malicious ways, but Arendt, actually, in other books besides this one, is quite devastating about people she knew and people who had been friends. In fact, I believe she says this in the Gauss interview. The awful thing was not what our enemies did. We knew we had enemies, of course. The awful thing was what our friends did. Okay?
Tina,
so, sorry.
Tina, let me just push you a little bit on your I don't know, because you do think a lot about that middle ground of complicity, including with your Chilean guy who you were just talking about. So when you say I don't know, what are you thinking about?
I don't know how particular to the situation that phenomenon was. I don't know how much it was a consequence of Jews feeling we are so assimilated here in Western Europe that we're not, nobody thinks of us as Jews anymore, which didn't turn out to be right, but that's the way a lot of people thought. I don't know how generalizable that phenomenon is. It's an unusual phenomenon and not the same as what happened to my Chilean, in that these people thought that their collaboration was going to save them, and it did not. It's a different situation.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that it is. And now I was trying to be entertaining, but let me do a little philosophy here.
We can be entertaining, too.
Yeah. Now, you see, I think the reason why the Jewish councils and the discussion of the inner immigrants, which occurs in the same place, is so important for the book. It's because she's making, and everybody said, oh, it's only 10 pages, and why are they getting upset about 10 pages? There's a philosophical thesis in the book that's really very radical. We tend to assume that evil actions require evil intentions, and that intention is the heart and soul of an ethical claim. Mm-hmm. And although Arendt was very influenced by Kant and wrote beautifully about Kant, she's actually attacking this very, it's a view that even people who are not Kantians hold, that somehow your inner subjective state is what's crucial for your responsibility. And I think the whole book is an attack on that, and an attempt to show that here you had this variety of intentions. Mm-hmm. Let's suppose, in her case, Eichmann didn't count. Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels were, sort of intending to be Nazis and, completely gripped by it. Let's say it turns out not Eichmann, but thousands, if not millions of people like him were bureaucrats who had sort of trivially bad intentions. Let's say that the heads of the Jewish councils, and of course by the time there were Jewish councils, they had already woken up to the fact that they weren't really Germans, they were, they were Jews. Let's say that they had the best intentions of all. They really did want to save as many lives and to prevent as much tragedy as they possibly could. Nevertheless, I think the point of the book philosophically is that intentions drop out. What counts is what you do.
But then, in that case, what they're guilty of is a very large miscalculation.
Yeah.
Not.
It's an error of judgment, and she's trying to move us from thinking about the location of ethics in intention to locating it in judgment. And I'm not 100% sure she's right, although I did, I incline that way. But I think we won't understand the Jewish council stuff unless we understand that there is a radical and general philosophical thesis here.
Let me now steer us a little bit from philosophy in a direct sense, and I'm sure we'll find our way back to it, to journalistic craft, because as we sort of hinted at the beginning, this book and some of her other work carries some extraordinary lessons for journalists. There are many young journalists in the room here. I know one of them for me, when I read this book and when I read it now, is the very unusual way that powerful narrative and and ideas come together. As journalists, we often keep ideas in the background or pretend that we don't even have them. We go and tell the story of a trial as if it just happened there, and whatever the ideas are underlying it are sort of implicit in what we do. But she puts them together. And you in your books sort of tried to do that too. How do you think about this ideas, narrative, documentation thing?
It's a very deliberate choice. I mean, in my first book, I knew I wanted to write about different kinds of ways people in Latin America were complicit in human rights violations. And I deliberately sat down and said, all right, this country, what's typical? What do I want to try and explain? Who am I going to find who embodies that? Mm-hmm. And then that was my main character. I did the same thing in The Haunted Land. I knew what phenomenon of dealing with the past I wanted to write about in Germany, in then Czechoslovakia, and in Poland. And I visited and did reporting until I found people whose stories embodied that idea. I think that if you are trying to write a semi-popular book, actually my books weren't all that popular, but that wasn't, the aim was to make them popular.
They were trade books,
yes.
anyway.
Right, non-academic. About ideas, you have to do it that way.
Was there a moment, as you were looking at these topics, or maybe even earlier, that you gave yourself permission to look at ideas and make that part of your reporting in this way?
They all started from the ideas. The reason I wrote The Haunted Land was, I remember I had moved back to the United States from Latin America, and I heard a report on NPR about the trial of the border guards in Berlin who were on trial for killing wall jumpers, for shooting people who were trying to flee over the Berlin Wall. And their defense, of course, was that they were following orders. And I sat up in bed and I said, wow, that's really, I've heard that before. And that was the genesis of The Haunted Land. Okay. It started with the idea of what is following orders? When is it justified? How do you make these decisions about the past and who is guilty? That was the genesis. And then I went and talked to the border guards, mm-hmm. and went to their trials.
And did you find you had to kind of wrestle with your journalistic technique when you began to focus more on ideas? Or did it just sort of follow?
No, I didn't. I mean, the problem is that it's not very neat sometimes. I mean, you're not going to find someone who is the perfect case study. So you find a bunch of people. And in fact, the trial I attended of the border guards in Berlin had 4 different border guards on trial, and they were all 4 very different and interesting ways, and they all 4 had something interesting to say about why they did what they did. You've got to be careful not to try and squeeze something into a box that it doesn't really fit in.
And you kind of come from, you have the opposite problem. You come from the realm of ideas, and you are focused on these massive, historically powerful ideas, the problem of evil, idealism, and moral clarity, but you're trying to make it into an accessible narrative, and your books are profoundly accessible. How do you think about ideas, narrative, research, history coming together?
I think you could actually make a stronger argument for focusing on particular human beings than that. Otherwise, any non-academic reader is going to get bored or not pick it up in the first place. I think there's a philosophical argument, and it's one that Arendt didn't quite make herself, but one could make it for her. See, if what's important, morally important, and important in lots of other ways, is judgment. Judgment is about the particular. She didn't live, she died over her typewriter with the first page of this book on judging. I think maybe it only had the heading or something. She didn't live to write that book, but it's not clear to me that you can actually say anything general about judgment, because it's really about applying general principles to particulars. And to do that, you have to focus on particular cases. If what turns out to count morally is not, did I have a good will and did I mean it well, or, was I somehow, brainwashed or diverted, if what really counts is how you act and what judgments you make in particular situations, then you have to focus on particular people because the range of possibilities is so enormous. Just to mention something I'm working on right now, I'm working on a book on heroism that grew out of my Tanner lectures, where I focused on John Brown. And I thought it was enormously interesting, and, of course, another immensely controversial figure in American history. If you don't go through the whole damn biography and read varying accounts and, talk about exactly what he did when, you can't answer the question. I got into that one because people say, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And I thought, philosophy ought to, or somebody ought to be able to say something more than that. That is, that should be the place to start thinking, not the place to throw up your hands. But there's no way to answer questions like that unless you delve very seriously into particular cases.
Yeah. Let me ask one other thing, and then maybe we'll begin to move toward a conversation with the room. This book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is as dark a work of journalism as they come, right?
I think so.
Well, in the sense, there are moments of light. There's the Schmidt story, there are the Danes, there are others, but it's moving meticulously through the career, actions, and consequences of one of the great war crimes of the 20th century, great crimes against humanity of the 20th century. And both of you have spent a lot of time looking at atrocity and evil. You with The Problem of Evil, you with your first two books. And we were talking about this earlier, both of you, by coincidence, have more recently focused on idealism and other kind of positive expressions of group pressure, society, and so on. Talk a little bit, maybe you, Tina, first, about how and why you made that shift from writing about atrocity to writing about the positive impact of peer pressure, which still looks at periods of atrocity. I was looking today at the section of your book in which you talk about Serbia and people creating the possibility of humane action in the midst of a society immersed in war crimes. Talk about that a little.
The first thing I want to say is that when you said this is such a dark book, my first thought was it's not quite as dark as the one work of journalism that I think is better than this.
What's that?
Anybody want to guess? What's the single best work of investigative journalism ever?
I'd be curious what you say.
No, I'd like to hear if anybody has any ideas. In Cold Blood? Interesting.
Silent Spring.
I'm thinking a little larger. I'm not a fan of Silent Spring.
Okay. Nominations?
Talk
Anyone
about
in the
that
room?
later, but
No? Go.
Gulag Archipelago.
Yeah.
But
The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Did anyone get that right? Who gets the door prize?
what did you say?
Yeah. But
Anyway, I guess I just sort of burned out. And, I still feel like I'm looking at serious subjects, but now I'm more interested in the rare cases where there are answers to these issues.
And talk a little bit about your column and this kind of cool project that you've got going. It's a
Okay.
good and entirely relevant opportunity.
Okay. Well, now my day job is I'm co-writer of a column called Fixes, which runs in the New York Times in the opinionator section every week, and then sometimes also in the Sunday Review. And every week we look at a different solution to a social problem and why it works. What is it that this approach does differently than other approaches that makes it more successful? And my writing partner, David Bornstein, and I decided that we wanted to basically change the journalistic paradigm in the United States. And, the reigning myth of journalism is that we cover problems. And someone else is going to be responsible for looking at the solutions. But I think we can fairly conclude after a long period of time that has not worked very well. And it doesn't, and society does better at solving problems when it can see some models and when it knows that there are some examples of how problems can be solved, and that it should be the job of journalists to write about that. Not in a fluffy way or a PR way or an advocacy way, but in a serious, critical way, to cover responses to problems the same way we cover the problems themselves. So now we run around the country working with different newsrooms and who are interested in this, which is quite a number of them, actually.
And how does this sort of tie together with this idea in your most recent book of the positive power of peer pressure, the ability of peer action to accomplish good, not just facilitate evil?
Now that I have my peer pressure glasses on, I see examples everywhere of how it accomplishes good. But initially when I told people I was working on a book on peer pressure, everyone assumes it's a negative force. And in some ways, I mean, this is sort of my version of the "are you a terrorist or are you a freedom fighter" argument. I mean, one person's community is another person's mob. And in the Serbia example, what I was writing about was a student group called Otpor, and how they basically got Serbs who were very uninterested in politics, felt very fatalistic, didn't think there was much they could do to get rid of Milosevic, and had stayed in their living rooms. They got people to go out on the street and become politically active, and they went from a group of 11 people to a group of 70,000 people in the space of 2 years. And they basically did it by throwing a party, small p, that everybody wanted to go to. And it was just so cool to belong that people got their friends out, and it was dangerous and risky, and you could be your own James Bond. But it was about how peer pressure can draw people into political activity. And whenever I sort of describe that in the outlines, people say, Nazi Germany.
I suppose, though, that at its best, journalism can itself be a kind of expression of that kind of positive peer pressure that you're talking about. It's an attempt to shape society's argument and story about itself. No?
I don't know. I don't know if I would call it peer pressure. It is a form of pressure. I don't know if I would call it peer pressure.
And Susan, now you have moved from writing about evil to writing about moral clarity and idealism. And in this other new project you're talking about, talk about that for you. Why not just stay with the bad guys? There's no. Yeah.
Well, I could say with Tina, I burnt out after a while, but it's more than that. Maybe it's not, but but I think there's something unholy, I will use that word, unholy and unhealthy about our fascination with evil. And all of us have it. Whether or not we write books about it, we click on weird crimes. Have you ever caught yourself, you think you're looking at the news and the Huffington Post has some weird crime, and you've got plenty to do, and you're actually trying to read Robert Reich's analysis of the economic situation, and you click. Well,
that's why, Susan. That's why.
There are larger and more important manifestations of this. I think we tend to forget good news very quickly, just extraordinarily quickly. And in my last book, people would sort of, come up to me and say, don't you know about whatever piece of it? And I would say, of course, we all know about that, but if we don't remember that we've actually made some progress in the world, we will never be able to make any more. We will simply lose heart. So I'm looking forward to reading Tina's new book, because I gathered it's a similar impetus. I do want to say just a word or two about Arendt, because I think one of the things that she was very much fighting in this book, and there are plenty of letters and other pieces that she wrote afterwards, she was really fighting our fascination with evil. She wanted Eichmann to be a clown. That is, it's not you know, and she thought it was important to point out that this was not a kind of figure of satanic greatness, as she says in the famous letter to Sholem, evil is like a fungus. And there's a point to that metaphor. Funguses aren't sexy, okay? Whereas grand, you know, powerful, Miltonic Lucifers are very attractive, and I think people, you know, get attracted to them. Just to make one more point, you said you thought this was the darkest work of journalism. Against that, I think we really have to put a marvelous quote of Mary McCarthy's, which I think is very important for anybody reading this book. Mary McCarthy wrote that reading the book made her think about Handel's Messiah and Figaro, both of which are concerned with redemption. And Arendt writes back, "You are the only person who understood me." And since, don't tell anyone, she says, but since writing that book, I've felt lighthearted about the whole thing. And I tried to understand.
Can you explain that?
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, I can. I mean, I wrote,
I'll buy the book. Give us the short version.
Yeah, the short version is this. I think that one of the reasons why this is such a philosophically important book, I think it's a project of theodicy. Now, it's a secular version of theodicy. That is, theodicy traditionally was defending God against the accusation that he had created a world with too much evil in it. Now, Arendt thought we should keep God out of public affairs, but although she does write in a letter to Jaspers that she herself had a private childlike belief in God, that she couldn't do anything about it except be grateful for it, okay? But it was crucial for her to give an account of evil which could, while acknowledging evil, okay, and facing up to Auschwitz and everything that meant, saw it as something fungus-like but not deep, not at the heart of the world.
No, that I get. I don't get the redemption. I don't get the Messiah.
Because
because
if Eichmann is a little figure, okay, and particularly if you can think through this in the way that she did, then the world is a place where she said the world is a place that I can love. The world is a place that I can find my way around in. And thinking can actually penetrate evil, okay?
So she is seeing the thinking about these acts as itself a gesture of resistance and redemption.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's actually a very practical relationship of all this to journalism. I mean, one of the motivating ideas behind the work we do at the Dart Center, which owes a lot to a few psychologist friends in this room and elsewhere, is in fact this alternation between approach and avoidance, fascination and repulsion with violence. And in telling the stories of great acts of atrocity, whether national atrocities of the sort you've chronicled, or even something relatively focused and local like the Newtown shootings, you talk to reporters and they're always struggling between, do I focus on the perpetrator, and if so, how much? It's the easy, in some ways, the easy out, or do I find another way to tell the story? Whose story is it really? And what about the aftermath and the pre-math, and where does all of this, how do I deal with my own interests, my own need to not get burned out, my own need to engage readers or viewers or downloaders? This is actually a very practical journalistic question in many ways that you're touching on, both of you here. Let's go to some conversation with the room, and just go up to the mic in the middle there. Just line up politely, calmly, and since this is being videotaped, please say your name for the great historical record. And we'll take it from there. And keep your questions concise, because there probably are many people who have things to say. This is a rich conversation.
Oh, you're first. Go ahead. Excuse me. My name is Doran Gopstein. I have a comment about this program, and I'll tell you some of the things that disturb me about it. I went to Columbia, both college and law school. I wrote hundreds of articles, edited hundreds of articles as managing editor of the Daily Spectator years ago. I came here because I've read a lot about Arendt, Eichmann. I remember when I was much younger actually watching the Eichmann trial on television when it was shown every night. I'm sure there are other people here for whom that's an indelible memory. That doesn't make it right, wrong, or anything else, but it's just part of our memory. When I saw the name of the program here, Hannah Arendt's Disruptive Truth-Telling, disruptive, yes. Truth-telling is a conclusion that one would come to after a full discussion with different views. Instead, what I found here was that right at the beginning, you had a conclusion. And the people who are on the panel, as accomplished as they are, do not present the range of views that would be necessary to show the people who disagree with Arendt. And Mr. Speer, when you started out talking in terms of journalism, I jotted down a couple of things. You said she refused easy answers. Ms. Rosenberg, you said she could decide for herself what she thought. Now, we know that for journalists and anybody else, those are the kind of qualities that get you attention and notoriety. It doesn't mean you're right. To be different, to be controversial, you can be just damn wrong, but you get attention and sometimes you do very well. So that has nothing to do with the merits. Ms. Neiman talked before, and this is the only discussion in the last hour. She said that there were countless attempts at refutation. Not refutations, attempts at refutation. That's the phrase you use. There are people who are as accomplished as you are who believe they didn't make an attempt at refutation but refuted her, that she was inaccurate. And not only in the last 2 weeks when the 700-page book came out, and you seem to be shocked at that, but years ago, there are people of the highest caliber who should have been on this panel so that we could test your views more than it was. And for journalists who are here, and I consider myself a lifelong journalist, although I'm a lifelong lawyer, and I have tried some of the biggest public kind of cases where I've spent years trying to get or to approximate to the truth. And I know how that difficult is as a litigator. It's hard. And whether you're a litigator or a journalist, you should ask tough questions. And I want to go to one more example, and I think it's very important for the journalists here. You asked, are there any other examples of banality of evil? Ms. Neiman took Citizens United. It's not a perfect example, but we know what you meant. And you said, I wonder, why don't we scream out, who took out my democracy? I wonder how many people in this room, when you heard that, nodded your head, meaning that, of course, Citizens United is a terrible thing. Maybe it's not banality. Let me just say something here that should make you and should make every journalist here say, oh my God, I didn't know that. The person who tried Citizens United in the United States Supreme Court is a very close friend of mine. I see him every week. He tried this case. He also argued the Pentagon Papers case. He also defended the New York Times for 20 years, defended you, Ms. Rosenberg, and your colleagues, and defended many other newspapers for freedom of speech, something which presumably is key to every journalist here.
And let me just say, not to cut you off, but be mindful of the other
Okay, I'll
folks.
finish, I realize it. And he believes, and has said many times and has written, that the actual legal issues in the Citizens United case provided a very clear case for support of freedom of speech. You stated it as a given that not only was it wrong, but it was almost a democracy falling apart. I wonder how many people here even know that. So I will conclude simply this way. For this program and for another program, I would never start a program by saying that I'm talking about her truth-telling when what we have is a very controversial person and a controversial, extraordinarily important person. And what I would have done is have one or two other people as accomplished as Ms. Rosenberg, as accomplished as Ms. Neiman, to truly drag out the issues, and that's what a good journalist should do.
Well, thank you for the thoughts. Comments, either of you?
No.
I mean, I can't possibly answer all the remarks you made. I have read the other attempts to undo Eichmann in Jerusalem, and for various reasons, I think they're deeply flawed. It isn't that I didn't know that they existed.
Well, and I think out of fairness to Susan Neiman, we did actually witness her having an argument with herself on this. So there is, in fact, a debate going on this question.
Yeah, I'm Yael Danieli. I'm a psychologist and a trauma specialist, and I built the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children. Quite a few years ago, I was also in Israel during the Eichmann trial. So it wasn't just being hooked to we didn't have television in those days. It was basically radio, or you went to Jerusalem. I also, Gideon Hausner was one of my closest friends, and his children still are. I'm quite familiar with the complexity of the emotional complexity of the debates. And you have not addressed it. You addressed it from a logical, philosophical point of view, and I've read her book. And I felt the hurt that survivors felt as well, reading her book. And Bruce, you'll have to answer, how do you evaluate her book from the point of view of the principles of the Dart Center for Ethical and Responsible Journalism? Excuse me, this is precisely why I came.
Fair enough, Yael, fair enough.
Fair enough. Also, Tina, I was wondering, I love your books, and I've also worked with genocides and with Latin America. You know that in psychology and in traumatology, we speak about social support as one of the crucial elements in healing from trauma or abating the effect of trauma. And I wonder how much of what you call peer pressure is social support, okay? Because there's an interesting, there are interesting implications for those. Yeah. I think that's enough.
You want to go for it? Go.
My answer is very simple. You're absolutely right. They're very, very closely related. Now you go.
I think, Yael, this is a very, very important question to which there are no easy answers, but I'll give you two. One is I have learned from people like from you and others about the importance in the long run of accurately laying out lines of accountability for atrocity, the importance for survivors and future generations, even when that accurate account may be very painful at times. It's a huge challenge for journalists. But I also think that there are, let me finish. I also think that there are competing narratives. There was a really interesting piece in the Forward, the Jewish Forward, 2-3 years ago, whose head title was something like, I can't remember the author right now, but it was essentially something like, What the Survivor Knows. And it was comparing the emotional truth, the emotional vividness of certain memories to Holocaust survivors with the factual work of historians who were challenging certain key pieces of that memory, including most controversially stories about soap and lampshades, right? And there was not to get into the accuracy of it, but it was a piece that attempted to come to terms in a way that, as journalists, we actually are dealing with all the time, with stories that represent the internal reality of the survivor experience, but may not always be factually accurate. And historians or journalists or investigators or Hannah Arendt in this case, no, wait, we can't do it tonight, later, who are laying out factual records that at risk and often trip over unintentionally and create great feelings of betrayal on the part of survivors when they uncover facts or narratives that don't, we'll talk later about it. But I think it's a very important question and a very important, nuanced part of the history of atrocity that we all need to deal with.
I completely agree with Bruce there, but you used the word logic pejoratively. I actually wasn't.
No, actually,
Okay. There is a tendency to feel that emotional truths are somehow deeper or more important than reasonable truths, and I really do want to insist that we need both, and we not.
And let's say, and yeah, we actually, and I will say this to anyone. I will say this to, no. I will say this to everyone. As we go through the questions, in order so that as many people can participate as possible, we certainly can continue arguing informally here in Hannah's Cafe after the formal end of the program. So, yes.
I'm a novice. I'm Nina Wolffeld. I'm about to have my first book published, but I'm definitely not as learned in the area of philosophy or of history as all of you. But in speaking of the complicity of the Jews, I was interested in the ethics of that complicity during such a time of desperation. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor. And I was also then struck by, and my mother and I fell on both sides of this argument vehemently after the movie, and that is, I had said that by doing the Eichmann trial and by writing this book, I felt that it was healing by confrontation, sort of healing her post-traumatic stress of what had happened as a Jew in exile to her. It's sort of two questions in one.
And who was in a concentration camp and, escaped, but, quite close shave.
Yeah, my father was not in a concentration camp. They fled for 16 months and arrived September 12, 1941 on the Navamar. And he owned Bon Marché. He grew up to be a pretty well-known retailer. And before he died, he left me 700 letters, and I translated them, and I've written a memoir. So that's how Forrest Gump got to stand here. But anyway, I was interested in both of those things.
Tina, any thoughts on that? Or any of this? I mean, you've actually dealt with this sort of emotional truth and historical truth thing, too.
I find that is sometimes a very dangerous line for journalists. I think that if you're trying to be accurate about the historical record, then you're going to piss a lot of people off. You're going to go against a lot of people's emotional truths. And that's just the way it is.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. No?
Go.
Well, I'm not sure that I understand the question about the moral complicity, because do you want to say a little bit more about it? Because I mean, what's clear from Arendt and what's clear from all of us is that it's just enormously complicated. If you're, put in a situation where there are almost only bad choices, it's very hard to make it's very hard to make judgments, but I'm not quite sure what the question was.
No, I was just interested in hearing you elaborate a little more upon that, because I know with my mother, she said, oh, it's terrible what Arendt said. It's awful, it's awful. I said, no. I think she was confronting what had happened to her, and also when they talked about this sort of complicity and the banality of evil, and certainly with Eichmann and the Jews who went along with it, it was sort of life-saving.
It's also, isn't it, about, and this is important to journalists, actually, I think, understanding that there are differentials of power even within profoundly victimized populations, and the possibility for abuse of power exists even among deeply victimized populations. There's a psychiatrist whom some folks in this room know named Jonathan Shea, who talks about, who likes to say, everybody understands that power corrupts, but powerlessness itself can also corrupt. And I think that underlies the question you are asking.
Thank you so much.
My name is Fred Kramer, and I just have a question to everyone. Was Hannah Arendt correct or wrong in her analysis of the second part? Should the Jewish councils have, I know it's complicated, collaborated to try and make things better, or in areas where they didn't collaborate, did the same result occur, that it didn't matter, or was it worse or better? That, I thought, was an important point in her book, and I don't know.
I don't know anything about that.
It seems to me that what she's saying is, there would have been murder, there would have been mass murder,
Yes.
there would have been torture, et cetera, but not as much of it.
Right. Is that true?
She says that explicitly, right?
Right. She says
makes
that in the book,
argument.
but is that true? The other researchers examine that.
So from what I know about the research, the jury is out.
Okay, thank you.
Let's leave it there. Todd.
Bruce, I'm sure when you scheduled this extremely impressive event, you didn't realize that it was going to follow by just a few days the finale of America's most extended, although semi-conscious conversation about evil in many years, namely Breaking Bad, which I've read almost broke the record for cable television viewing, coming a million plus short of the previous title holder, and perhaps still, the finale of The Sopranos. Another kind of rumbling about problems of evil. If I may be indulged an awkward segue. What you all are trying to do here, and those of us who are in attendance are also trying to do, is to engage in a conversation about what constitutes evil and what degrees of freedom people have in what Robert J. Lifton calls atrocity-producing situations. I'm struck, Susan, you mentioned this piece of, I'll call it neutrally revisionist scholarship about Eichmann. This has, I gather, been a while in the coming, because in Berlin 2.5 years ago, at an exhibit in the Museum of Crimes, whatever it's called, was a video of an interview conducted by a Dutch Nazi journalist with Eichmann in Argentina before he was captured, in the course of which it becomes quite clear that he's a raving anti-Semite. And evidently this was kept out of the trial, or so I've read.
But Tina Stangnet, the woman who wrote this book, was also involved in constructing the exhibit, and the book came out about 2.5 years ago in Germany.
Great,
so
great.
I just read
But I'm actually going somewhere else with this. We continue to learn. I continue to learn, as somebody who read, like Bruce was also in my late teens, read Eichmann in Jerusalem at the time, thought it spoke to our contemporary situation in many ways. So, and it was, I would say, formative, a very formative book for me. But I continue to learn things that challenge it. So, for example, we have an exhibit, we have the book you mentioned, Stein is her name?
Stangnet, but...
Okay, we have, and then just at the New York Film Festival, I don't know if it's shown yet, but there is about to be shown a 3.5 hour leftover documentary by Claude Lanzmann. That is to say, leftover in the sense that he conducted extensive interviews with what he calls the last of the unjust. That's the title of the film. The final Viennese rabbi to preside over whatever it was called, the Jewish Council or something like that, somebody who actually worked with Eichmann. And I didn't get to see the last hour of the film. I saw 2.5 hours of it. The 2.5 hours did convince, we see, by the way, Lanzmann conducted these interviews in the early 70s when he was working on Shoah, then decided, I'm not sure why, to leave it out of Shoah, then went back and re-interviewed and commented upon this guy and the interviews. It's layered. In any case, I was pretty well persuaded that in the situation this man was, I can't remember his name, not only were there no good choices, but there were really awful choices. That is to say, there were not the degree, and it was, I would further say, in the contemporary moment, as I tried to imagine it, there is no calculus that could have told you with any assurance which was going to be the least horrible choice, because the future was the future, and because there were, it's simply beyond even, I think, God's reason to anticipate the outcomes. Now, and then we have also, and I hate to break this, I don't know if you're up on this. Yeah, I'm getting there. There is now a revisionism about Stanley Milgram and his experiments,
heard about that,
which
yeah.
I have read only a bit into it. Milgram also very forceful in all this. Well, the numbers in his experiment were extremely small, like 2 digits. And there are 2 books now. I can't say any more about it, except I found them convincing that there were problems here. But this is really where I'm going. Is it not the case that what we want is not a definitive judgment about what constitutes evil, but the taking seriously of the problem of evil so that it's a live question? So that, for example, Bruce, you did a session a few months ago with Nick Terse on Vietnam evil. You know, this country still doesn't want to know what we did in Vietnam, let alone, I mean, how long will it take before we actually have a conversation about Iraq? That's it. I'm sorry. There's not a question mark.
Quick thoughts, colleagues, on this?
I think that the tendency when you're dealing with crimes of the past is usually, historically, it's been gross oversimplification. And usually you can predict what people are going to say based on their political and economic interests. It's an argument about the present. It's not always an argument about the past. But the places that in my opinion, have done the best at dealing with the past, and by best I mean have given the most comfort to the victims and done the most to change the political culture of their countries so that they can do the best they can to ensure it doesn't happen again, are ones that have treated the process with the complexity that it deserves and perhaps don't come to any conclusions. Leave it open, let people deal with it in different ways. Yes, the state has a role, but I think you're right about that. I think that's very important.
Well, and I think the problem is not only in dealing about the past, but also in dealing about the future. You know, I mean, if it's past, it's a counterfactual, as Felix just pointed out to me, and we can't decide whether, you know, if somebody had 3 terrible choices, which one would have saved the most lives. There's no way we can know that. And in a certain sense, we also can't have certainty about, you know, the terrible or less terrible choices. But I like the idea that simply taking these questions really seriously from a variety of perspectives, it'll help some. You know, it won't do as much as we'd like it to do, but it'll help some.
There's an essay by Adam Michnik called Maggots and Angels, which I think is the best statement. He's very much against judgment. He really does agree with what you just said, that you cannot know the counterfactuals. And I think coming from him especially, it was a very persuasive argument.
I would take a slightly different tack on that one. I think, and actually, I think of this as a journalistic problem and as something specifically to take away from Eichmann in Jerusalem. One of the things that I think, one of the tensions in the book is about legal justice. This is a legal, quasi-legal, fully legal, maybe not process. There's been what today we would call an extraordinary rendition. There's a somewhat one-sided trial. There's all this sort of stuff, but it's a trial. And at the end, the question of whether there's justice in this is, she kind of says it's not really about justice. My own view has come to be that there are situations in this world, atrocities large and small, for which there really will never be effective legal justice. But the role of journalists can be to provide a kind of narrative justice which wrestles with the complexities of choice, which wrestles with both the massively accountable, the colluding, and the complexities of victimization. I do think that we as journalists have a big responsibility toward a kind of narrative justice.
I do want to disagree with you about reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, because I think she very much does think it was a just decision and a just court. Yeah. What she criticizes, and this is the point that you were making, was Gideon Hauser's attempt to tell the story of the Holocaust in ways that weren't relevant to the question whether this man is guilty or not guilty. She's one of the few people, actually, to defend the decision to give him the death penalty. She was one of the few people to say that Israel did have the right to try him. I mean, a lot of people disagreed about that, and she didn't. Now, what I think she didn't realize, and this was the point that was made before, is what kind of cathartic function the trial had in Israel, that it was performing an important function that she couldn't have paid attention to. But she certainly does think that it was about justice.
Susan, I wonder whether the cathartic function was the effect of the verdict or the effect of allowing people to testify.
Allowing them to testify.
Because
totally.
those are two very different things. I think justice, trials in a court of law, if it had been strictly held according to the rules of good due procedure, those people would not have been allowed to testify.
Exactly.
Because they were irrelevant to Eichmann himself. Mm-hmm. But I mean, justice is not necessarily the best way to produce a cathartic function. Mm. And even when it is, it's so expensive and it's so limited that it doesn't help that many people. But I think that the telling your story, the emotional truth, is very valuable.
You might know the Israeli journalist Tom Segev's terrific book, The Seventh Million, in which he talks about the fact that until the Eichmann trial, Holocaust survivors were not only, not put at the forefront, they were actually, people were ashamed of them, they didn't talk, they didn't testify. Really good book, really worth reading, because it went against the founding myth of the State of Israel. So it was simply talking about their experiences as victims, which no one wanted to do in the early State of Israel, that was important.
And let's just say quick questions and quick answers, even though that's against Hannah Arendt's spirit, it is against the clock, we lose the room. Quick questions, quick answers.
Hello, good evening. Mine's a quick question, I think. So I have a question as a future journalist, which I hope is useful to the other future journalists in the room. But I know we've touched on this quite a bit, but Tina, you mentioned that as journalists, we should also focus on a response to problems rather than just the problems themselves. But my question is, how do we do this by not losing a biased point of view and, not losing our credibility as journalists?
I don't think reporting on responses to problems is any different than reporting on the problems. The same standards you would use to say, this is a problem, I know it enough, I have enough evidence, I'm sure of it enough that it is going to go in the newspaper, it's a story. You can do the same thing in the other direction. Your job isn't to call winners or to make predictions or to make any claims other than what the evidence allows you to claim. All you do is report on what people are doing and what effects it's having.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sir. And again, we're into quick questions and quick answers.
My name is Don McMahon. I'm a statistician up at the medical school. So I'm going to pose a dilemma. It seems to me that journalists are humans. Hannah Arendt was certainly a human. And I think what she presents is a complex life informed by a lot of trauma and a lot of concern for humanity. coupled with a real philosophical argument with Kantian moral clarity. And the Eichmann trial presents for her an opportunity to personally wrestle through her own conflicts with that Kantian moral clarity in a way that allows her to present to the public something that is accessible both to the moral philosopher and to the lay reader. And I think for a journalist, being able to find a forum that allows you to span the range of audience and create a discussion rather than present conclusions is really what journalism is about. And I think she does a great job.
Couldn't have said it better. Statisticians are human too. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Xiaorong Gu, and my never finished dissertation is on the banality of evil. My question is very simple. Is it possible for we human beings to prevent the banality of evil in the future? And if so, how?
You too.
Simple question. You go.
Quick questions, quick answers, but this is a real thing.
So, look, I think Todd Gitlin's point was quite right, even though it won't satisfy you entirely. Taking these things seriously, having serious discussions about the banality of evil or non-banal forms of evil, which also exist, with other people who challenge you, or reading books of the kind that Tina has written about, not endlessly please the Nazis, but let's focus on some other cases, which I think is enormously important. Comparing how, evil takes various banal forms, complicity takes various forms in different historical settings, in different cultures. It can only sensitize you. It can't prevent it. There isn't a magic cure, but it can sensitize you.
I would just like to point out that the reason that Eichmann was banal was that he was exactly like he didn't need a conscience because he was listening to everybody around him. He lived in a society where that way of thinking was considered normal. That came about because you had Hitler in power in Germany. So it goes back to a situation of government creating the ability to have an atrocity. What was it?
Atrocity-producing situation.
Atrocity-producing situation. So
let me just bring up one. Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me just bring up something that I'm not sure I want to call evil, but it's a matter of sensitizing yourself to. One of the more interesting parts of Eichmann in Jerusalem talks about language and what language does with us. Let's take the fact that certain things like health care or a pension are called benefits in this country, okay? Benefits. In Germany, they're called social obligations. I don't know what, I don't know enough other languages, but if you just think about the way that, shifts our thinking as to what we owe society, what society owes us, it's enormous.
And I think also the language that gets applied to violence, that either normalizes violence or says it's a bad thing, is very important. There's a great journalist named Richard Rhodes who has written many books about violence in many forms, everything from child abuse to the atomic bomb. And one of the consistent themes in his book is that people need to be educated for violence. He talks about violent coaching as something that it's something we as journalists can track, and also about euphemisms that are created to cover up acts of violence. Mm-hmm. So we resist the banality when we call things by what they are, when we call evil by what it is.
Hi.
Jack Saul gets the last word.
I'm the last.
Yeah.
That's you.
Okay, I'm Jack Saul. I'm a psychologist. I made also the move from working with victims of torture to now studying perpetrators of torture, and also studying systems, complex social systems in which torture takes place. And I feel like we're missing a kind of perspective that's very important, and that is the social scientific study of these systems. There are anthropologists that now study how is it? What are the conditions that lead to these people committing evil? And they're very complex systems. Some people are kind of very sadistic and evil in these systems. There's a range of different characters, but there's a range of different conditions that come together that create these atrocity-producing situations. And we need to bring this kind of inquiry into this discussion. And I think it's also a very important type of inquiry that journalists need to know of in order to be better investigative journalists about these kind of issues. And we are working on torture prevention. It's a very important field these days in human rights.
Yeah.
Okay?
Thoughts, either of you?
You're absolutely right, and I can't wait to read that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I would like to thank Tina Rosenberg, Susan Neiman for being so generous with their time and thoughts on such very difficult subjects. Buy their books. Thank all of you. I also want to thank the Dart Center staff who are all here doing various things.
Yes.
And Alan Shin taking nice pictures and all sorts of folks. But also do remember, if you like this and want to see more, help us out. There are donation cards in the back.